It was supposed to be a quick hike, just a few hours on a mountain trail. But by the end of that night, 3 children would be pulled out of a freezing Utah canyon by helicopter, one of them unconscious and fighting for his life. And investigators would soon be asking a horrifying question. Was this a tragic accident, or was it something much darker? For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. Nothing about the morning of October 11th suggested danger. In fact, for anyone watching from the outside, it looked like an ordinary outing. A father, Micah Smith, loading up his 3 young children, ages 2, 4, and 8, for what he described as a fun day in the mountains east of Salt Lake City. But the moment they arrived at the Broads Fork trailhead in Big Cottonwood Canyon, nothing about Smith's choices made sense. Not the time they started, not the route he picked, and definitely not what he brought or failed to bring for 3 small children. Broads Fork isn't a casual family walk in the woods. Regular hikers describe it as steep, rugged, and unforgiving, especially as you gain elevation. The trail climbs fast, moving from well-marked paths into rocky terrain and dense brush. And on that day, the weather wasn't calm. A cold front had been sliding over northern Utah, exactly the kind of system where storms form quickly and temperatures drop without warning. Still, Smith pressed ahead, taking his children up a trail that experienced hikers often avoid in poor conditions. As investigators would later note, he did so with no extra clothing, no survival gear, no emergency supplies, and absolutely nothing capable of protecting the kids if the weather turned hostile. And it would, very quickly. From the early stages, Smith's behavior on the mountain raised red flags, details that only made sense later when the full timeline came together. Rather than keeping his children together and focused, investigators say he led them off the main trail, pushing them into areas so rough that trained rescue teams themselves would later struggle to pass through. This wasn't just a few feet off the path. This was steep slopes, tangled brush, loose rock, and terrain meant for expert climbers, not toddlers. By the time temperatures started dropping, the children were already showing signs of distress. Hiking boots weren't keeping their feet warm. Their clothing was soaked from rain. The wind was picking up, and the youngest child, only 2 years old, was crying and becoming less responsive. Most parents would have turned back long before it got this far. But according to the recovered statements from the 8-year-old girl, their father didn't turn back. Instead, he kept going. At one point, the weather shifted violently. Hail, freezing rain, and snow all hitting the mountain at once. Temperatures plummeted. Wind chill scraped down to life-threatening levels. And as the storm intensified, the children were becoming dangerously cold. Exposure doesn't need hours to become deadly. In conditions like those, it can happen fast, especially to children whose bodies lose heat at more than twice the rate of adults. The exact timeline of what happened in those final hours remains at the center of the investigation. But what is clear is this. Somewhere high on that mountain, one of the children stopped responding. The 4-year-old boy became limp, unresponsive, and dangerously cold. His 8-year-old sister later told investigators she tried performing CPR on him, an image that still haunts everyone who has read the police documents. Imagine that for a moment. An 8-year-old little girl, soaked, freezing, exhausted, trying desperately to save her brother's life with no help, no shelter, and no tools. And while she fought to keep him alive, investigators say her father was behaving in ways that search teams would later describe as bizarre and detached from reality. One of the children is dead. Hours later, when rescuers finally spotted Smith from the air, he didn't wave them down, didn't signal distress the way most lost hikers do. According to the reports, when they approached, Smith coldly stated that one of his children was dead. But he hadn't checked. He hadn't attempted CPR. He hadn't tried to warm the child or carry him to safety. And the rescuers would soon discover something even more disturbing. All 3 children were found underdressed for conditions that were well below freezing. No coats, no gloves, no proper winter gear, nothing that could have possibly kept a toddler, a preschooler, and a young child alive on a night like that. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. Getting to the children wasn't simple. The terrain was so dangerous that 2 rescuers were injured themselves trying to reach them. Eventually, A DPS helicopter had to be brought in for a hoist extraction, something that's only done when there's no safe alternative. When the 4-year-old boy was finally lifted from the canyon, he was unconscious. His core temperature, once measured, was 62.6 degrees Fahrenheit. For context, 95 degrees Fahrenheit is mild hypothermia. 82 degrees Fahrenheit is severe. Below 70 degrees Fahrenheit is often fatal. That little boy had slipped into a state where the body begins shutting down entirely. Doctors later revealed he suffered a stroke and required emergency skull surgery. The 2-year-old and 8-year-old were also severely hypothermic, but thanks to the rapid response of medical teams, they survived. When detectives questioned Smith, they expected confusion, remorse, or panic. Instead, they got statements that only deepened their concerns. He claimed the trail was safe. He insisted the weather wasn't that bad. He said the hike was normal. And when confronted with the children's condition, he reportedly made bizarre, almost scripted-sounding comments. One of those comments was recorded by rescuers. "You shall not pass." Investigators described his demeanor as detached, almost emotionless, even as his children lay in critical condition. At first, many people believed this was simply a tragic hiking accident. A father who made terrible decisions. A day that went wrong. A storm no one expected. But when detectives dug deeper, looking at the timeline, the children's statements, the terrain, and Smith's choices, the story stopped looking like an accident. It started looking intentional. The district attorney later said parts of the case were a once-in-a-lifetime situation, not because of the rescue, but because of the details emerging from the investigation. And as those details continued to build, one question rose to the front of every investigator's mind. What was Micah Smith really doing on that mountain with his children? Because when prosecutors finally laid out their findings before a grand jury, the events on that mountain began to look less like a tragic mistake and more like deliberate, prolonged torture. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. When Micah Smith was airlifted off the mountain with his unconscious son and 2 hypothermic daughters, the situation still looked, at least on paper, like a terrible accident. A wrong turn, a freak storm, a father who panicked. But within hours of the rescue, the tone shifted. Doctors, detectives, and child specialists all began to notice the same thing. Nothing about the children's condition matched Micah Smith's version of events. And within 3 days, those inconsistencies would grow into a full criminal indictment. One that prosecutors said revealed a level of suffering that went far beyond negligence. The moment the children were stabilized, investigators began the process of forensic interviews. These weren't casual conversations. Utah's protocols required that trained child interviewers meet with the children privately, without leading questions, and with every statement recorded. Those interviews would become the core of the case, statements that prosecutors later described as harrowing, consistent, and deeply troubling. And they began with the oldest child, the 8-year-old girl who had fought to save her brother's life on the mountain. Interviewers noted that she was polite, quiet, and extremely cautious at first. But when asked to describe the hike, she didn't talk about fun, adventure, or getting lost. She described fear. She told investigators they were cold very early in the hike. Their father pushed them higher even when they begged to stop. They left the main trail. The terrain became so steep she had to climb on her hands. The 2-year-old stumbled repeatedly. Her father ignored her brother's shivering. And most disturbing, she said they were not allowed to turn back. What struck detectives was how consistently she used those words. Not allowed. This wasn't framed as a mistake or a situation that got out of control. She described it as something her father insisted on doing, even while the children cried. She also described seeing her little brother, the 4-year-old, collapse. She said his eyes looked strange, and that he wasn't talking anymore. She tried to give him mouth-to-mouth, something she had apparently seen her mother do on a family member once. The room fell silent when she described her father's reaction. According to her interview, he just stared. She said he didn't check the boy's pulse. He didn't try to warm him. He didn't help her attempt CPR. He simply said, "He's dead," and kept walking. While the 8-year-old was being interviewed, doctors were documenting the injuries and conditions of the younger children. And what they found did not match Micah Smith's story of an ordinary hike gone wrong. The 4-year-old's body temperature, recorded at 62.6 degrees Fahrenheit upon rescue, was one of the lowest survivable readings the hospital had seen. Severe hypothermia alone was expected, given the circumstances, but there were also signs that raised even more questions. His clothing was inadequate for the temperature. His feet and hands showed signs of early frostbite. He had multiple bruises in different stages of healing. He had abrasions consistent with falling on steep terrain without being guided or assisted. A stroke was confirmed shortly after arrival. Emergency neurosurgery saved his life, but doctors were clear. This was not a simple accident. His deterioration would have been visible long before collapse. Parent would have seen it. Parent should have acted. But according to investigators, Smith did not. And the medical findings would later be used by prosecutors to argue that this was not just reckless behavior, it was prolonged knowing harm. A forensic interview with a toddler is extremely delicate. But even at her young age, the 2-year-old said several things that corroborated the older sibling's account. "Daddy made us go up. I cold. Daddy no stop. Brother fall down." She also repeated a phrase interviewers did not expect. "Daddy was mad. Press gently," using non-leading child forensic protocols. The toddler said her dad was angry when they slowed down. She demonstrated this by shaking her hands and stomping her foot. Her statements, simple as they were, lined up with the timeline investigators were building. The children were pushed far beyond their limits, ignored when they cried, and given no protection from the elements even as conditions became life-threatening. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. While investigators were gathering statements from the children, detectives also sat down with Smith for a formal interview. His answers raised immediate concerns. Instead of expressing guilt, panic, or remorse, he doubled down on strange explanations. He claimed the trail wasn't that cold. He said the children were fine until the moment they collapsed. He described the conditions as manageable and normal. He insisted the clothing they wore was appropriate. Detectives knew this last statement was demonstrably false. Every rescuer had reported the children were dressed in thin layers. No gloves, no coats, and no insulated protection. The 4-year-old was found in shorts. When asked why he didn't turn back, he gave an answer that stunned investigators. "We were supposed to be up there." He wouldn't elaborate. He wouldn't explain what he meant, but he repeated it more than once. Later, police records noted his tone as detached, flat, and oddly emotionless. Combined with the children's statements, detectives now believed this was not an innocent case of getting lost. This was intentional endangerment. Prosecutors and detectives spent the next several days assembling evidence. GPS data showing they went far off the safe trail. Weather records proving storms were predicted. Terrain mapping showing the areas he led the children into were dangerous even for adults. Medical reports confirming the severity and duration of the hypothermia. Children's forensic statements describing coercion, fear, and being forced to continue. Smith's own contradictory and disturbing statements. The district attorney described the evidence as deeply alarming. What began as a rescue operation had become a major criminal case. On November 1st, prosecutors officially filed charges. Micah Smith was indicted on 3 counts of aggravated child abuse, a first-degree felony, 1 count of child torture related to extreme physical harm and prolonged suffering, reckless endangerment, failure to provide necessities. The most severe charge, child torture, was based on the prolonged exposure to lethal conditions, the refusal to turn back, and the children's testimony that they were forced to continue despite begging to stop. Prosecutors emphasized that torture, under Utah law, doesn't require intentional infliction of pain in the traditional sense. It includes knowingly placing children in circumstances where extreme suffering is inevitable. And on that mountain, suffering had been guaranteed. While Smith was being held in jail, the children were placed under state protective custody. Doctors monitored them daily, The 4-year-old's prognosis remained uncertain. He had survived the stroke, but doctors could not yet determine whether there would be long-term neurological damage. The 2-year-old showed signs of trauma and separation anxiety. The 8-year-old, despite her composure during interviews, had night terrors and persistent fear that her father would come get them. A protective order barred Smith from any contact whatsoever. For prosecutors, the children's well-being became a central focus. For investigators, their testimony had become the backbone of the case. And for the public, the question now shifted away from the mountain itself to something far more unsettling. Why had Micah Smith taken them there at all? Because when detectives dug into Smith's past, his beliefs, his behavior, and the disturbing pattern emerging from old reports, it became clear that this mountain hike was not an isolated incident. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. When detectives finally turned their attention to Micah Smith's background, they weren't looking for a complex criminal history. They weren't expecting a violent past. In most cases like this, investigators mostly find warning signs tied to stress, isolation, or poor judgment. But what they found instead was something else entirely. Pattern. A slow, steady escalation of behaviors, documented in reports, messages, and concerned statements from people who had known him, that suddenly made the nightmare on the mountain feel less like a tragic anomaly and more like the predictable outcome of a man spinning further and further out of control. Tracing the timeline backward, detectives first focused on the year leading up to the hike. As they reviewed prior welfare calls and contacts involving Smith and the children, they noticed a repeating theme. Micah Smith had been making increasingly alarming decisions long before October 11th. While there were no previous felony charges, several incident reports pointed to a man whose behavior was drifting into dangerous territory, emotionally, mentally, and practically. Neighbors had noted odd interactions. Extended family had expressed worry at times. A few acquaintances described him as paranoid or erratic. Nothing rose to the level of criminal prosecution, but taken together, they told a story of a father whose grip on reality was slipping, and who was still responsible for 3 vulnerable children. One of the earliest red flags detectives uncovered was Smith's increasingly obsessive behavior about spiritual testing, personal trials, and the belief that challenges were meant to prove something. Multiple people close to him described a shift in the months before the incident. He talked about strength being built through suffering. He believed adversity revealed truth. He made references to being guided without offering specifics. He said he needed to take the kids into nature more often. None of these alone were crimes. In fact, many parents talk passionately about nature, spirituality, or resilience. But investigators noticed a disturbing twist. His explanations were often vague, circular, and disconnected from practical reality. And as the months went on, the ideas grew more extreme. In private messages uncovered through search warrants, Smith wrote phrases suggesting, "We're being prepared. This is the only way forward. Suffering is part of growth." Detectives reviewing these messages flagged them as concerning, not because they revealed a criminal plan, but because they highlighted the distorted beliefs prosecutors said could explain the decisions he made on the mountain. Another major factor investigators uncovered was the custody dispute between Smith and the children's mother. While specific details remain sealed due to family court confidentiality, what is known from public and police records is this. In the months leading up to the incident, custody arrangements had shifted, and Smith was under significant stress. According to interviews collected during the investigation, he felt he was losing control. He had financial challenges. He expressed resentment over perceived limits on his time with the kids. He withdrew from social supports. He avoided conversations that challenged his behavior. Detectives later stated that the custody pressure appeared to exacerbate Smith's already unstable mindset. While custody disputes do not make someone violent, prosecutors noted that his emotional volatility increased substantially as the legal battle intensified. One acquaintance told investigators, "Micah started talking like he was alone in the world, like he didn't trust anyone anymore. And that isolation, combined with his emerging fixation on tests and challenges, now looked far more troubling in hindsight. As investigators pushed deeper, another pattern emerged. One that prosecutors said was critical to understanding the mountain incident. There had been previous outings with the children that raised concern. These didn't involve mountain rescues or criminal charges, but they fit into a disturbing escalation. Long hikes with inadequate supplies, pushing the children beyond reasonable limits, ignoring signs of exhaustion, taking them into unsafe terrain, refusing to turn back even when they asked. Family members described moments where the children returned home, sunburned, dehydrated, emotionally distressed, and once, according to a relative, shaking and crying after being outside for hours. Again, none of these incidents were prosecuted at the time. They were warnings, subtle but significant. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. Detectives later wrote that these behaviors showed a pattern of disregarding the children's safety and well-being, something that became key to establishing intent in the final indictment. In other words, the mountain hike wasn't the first time he ignored the children's limits. It was simply the most catastrophic. While reviewing interview footage, detectives noticed something else. Smith's responses lacked emotional grounding. He did not appear devastated, confused, or remorseful. Instead, he seemed detached, talking about the hike as if it were a symbolic trial. When investigators pressed him, he became evasive. When they asked why he didn't turn back, he referred to what was supposed to happen. When they questioned the inadequate clothing, he insisted the children were prepared enough. When they confronted him with the medical evidence, he claimed he didn't know they were that cold. Detectives noted that his tone was calm, too calm. One investigator later described his demeanor. It was like he wasn't talking about children, he was talking about an idea. This raised difficult questions. Was he experiencing a mental health crisis? Was he acting on delusional beliefs? Or did he consciously choose to ignore the danger? Prosecutors didn't need to prove a mental disorder. They only needed to show that he knowingly placed the children in harm's way. And everything they uncovered pointed to exactly that. Their evidence included digital messages reflecting harmful beliefs, interview transcripts showing coercion and fear, medical documentation of long-term stress effects in the children, prior reports showing repeated neglectful behavior, witness statements linking his emotional decline to increased risk for the children, expert testimony on hypothermia timelines and preventability. And as the months passed, the picture solidified. The hike was not a spontaneous mistake. It was the culmination of a pattern that had been building, quietly, steadily, and in plain sight. One detail detectives uncovered troubled them more than almost anything else. Several weeks before the incident, an acquaintance had expressed worry about the children's safety during one of Smith's outdoor excursions. They had noticed the children looked frightened and physically strained. They reportedly told him, "They're too little for this." And according to the person's statement, Micah answered, "They need to be stronger. Life isn't easy." No one knew at the time that this mindset would soon escalate into a near tragedy on a freezing mountain. As the children recovered physically, forensic interviewers met with them again, carefully, ethically, without suggestion. Now that they were safer and more comfortable, additional details began to emerge. The oldest said this wasn't the first time she felt unsafe outdoors. She described moments where her father ignored their cries. She said he talked about tests and being strong. She said he wouldn't listen when they were scared. She said he believed they had to do it. These statements were critical. They helped prosecutors argue that Smith's behavior was knowing, repeated, and escalating. Pattern. One that nearly ended in death. Because when the case finally reached the courtroom, and the children's voices, medical experts, and investigators all took the stand, prosecutors revealed something that stunned the public. There was a moment on the mountain where Micah Smith had a clear chance to save all 3 children. And he chose not to. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. Courtrooms are designed to be neutral spaces, quiet, structured, and controlled. But when the trial of Micah Smith opened, the room felt charged. Not from the cameras, not from the reporters, but from the anticipation surrounding the one question everyone had been waiting for. What really happened on that mountain, and why? Prosecutors promised that the answer would become clear through testimony. And as the trial unfolded, their case hinged on a moment the public had never heard about. A moment the state believed proved Smith had a clear opportunity to save all 3 children, but didn't take it. Smith entered the courtroom appearing calm, the same detached expression investigators had noted months earlier. He wore a suit provided by his defense team, hair neatly trimmed, posture controlled. The public narrative had already shifted dramatically. Initially, a now-defunct GoFundMe page had hailed Smith as a hero who had bravely sacrificed himself to save his children. But those claims crumbled as police released the indictment details, revealing a father who chose to prioritize summiting a mountain over his children's safety. The charges hanging over him were severe: aggravated child abuse, child torture, intentional infliction of serious physical injury, felony child endangerment. Each count carried heavy penalties. Combined, they reflected the prosecution's core argument that this was not a hiking accident. It was a sequence of deliberate decisions that placed 3 children in life-threatening danger. The courtroom fell silent when the prosecutor delivered the opening statement. This case is not about a storm. It is not about a trail. It is about a father who had multiple chances to protect his children and chose not to. The first major witnesses were the search and rescue experts who had responded that night. A veteran rescue officer described the terrain with stark detail. Impassable for small children, no rational path forward, 0 chance of accidental navigation into that section. He explained that even trained adults avoid the area where Smith led the kids. The slope requires technical experience, and the weather that day made it exponentially more dangerous. Another rescuer, who was injured during the extraction, testified that the children looked frozen, terrified, and far beyond the point of exhaustion. But then came the most damning expert witness, a mountain survival specialist. He stated firmly, this was not survivable for children without immediate shelter. Any reasonable adult would know to turn back long before they reached that point. The jury took notes. Several shook their heads in disbelief. Doctors were next. Their testimony was difficult to hear. The physician who treated the 4-year-old boy, the child whose temperature dropped to 62.6 degrees Fahrenheit, explained the medical timeline. Shivering would have stopped early. Confusion and slurred speech would follow. Organ systems begin to shut down. Brain swelling becomes likely. Death can occur without warning. When asked whether the boy would have shown visible signs of distress long before reaching that temperature, the doctor was blunt. Absolutely. No adult responsible for his care could have missed it. Another doctor described the 2-year-old's condition upon arrival as minutes from irreversible collapse. The 8-year-old girl's injuries were emotional as well as physical. She had suffered early-stage frostbite, but her psychological trauma, exhaustion, terror, and the burden of trying to resuscitate her younger brother was significant. Her medical report noted, she believed she was responsible for keeping her siblings alive. The jury listened in stunned silence. Though the children did not testify in person due to their ages, the court permitted video excerpts from their recorded forensic interviews. The prosecution also introduced chilling evidence found on Smith's own phone. It was painful to watch. In the video, the 8-year-old spoke quietly but clearly. I told Dad we were too cold. I asked him if we could go back. He said we had to keep going. My brother kept falling. In one recovered video recorded by Smith as the storm moved in, the daughter's voice could be heard asking the question that would haunt the case. Are we going to freeze to death, Daddy? Smith's voice could be heard responding that they were almost to the top, ignoring the fear in her voice. At another point in her interview, the daughter described when her father stopped her from going back down the trail. When she said she was scared, he told her, "You shall not pass." According to charging documents, the courtroom was silent, except for the sound of a juror quietly crying. The 4-year-old's interview was shorter, scattered with childlike phrasing, but it reinforced the same reality. I was cold. Dad said keep walking. I fell asleep on the mountain. The prosecutor ended the segment early, sparing the court the most distressing parts. But the impact had already landed. For more true crime stories like this, hit the subscribe button. Then came the revelation prosecutors had hinted at for months. A search and rescue supervisor took the stand to describe the helicopter footage and audio from the extraction team. These recordings showed something investigators had not disclosed publicly. At one point during the storm, before the children collapsed, Smith reached a location where the trail reconnected with a safe, well-marked route back to the canyon floor. A rescue map was shown to the jury. The prosecutor pointed to a clear, unmistakable line. This is where he could have turned around. Not hours later, not after the storm. Right here. Evidence showed cell service was available at that point. Weather conditions were less severe. The children were cold but not yet hypothermic. Returning would have taken under an hour. The route was safe and used by dozens of hikers that day. According to the survival expert, if he had turned back at that point, all 3 children would almost certainly have survived without life-threatening injuries. When asked why Smith didn't turn back, investigators quoted his own interview. "I believed we were supposed to continue." The prosecutor let that sentence hang in the air. The defense argued mental instability. They claimed Smith had been experiencing a break from reality, driven by stress, isolation, and emotional collapse. They emphasized he was not violent. He loved his children. He lacked intent. He was overwhelmed, not malicious. They called a psychological expert who suggested Smith's decisions aligned with acute mental disorganization. But the prosecution countered by introducing evidence of Smith's spiraling behavior, which extended beyond the hike itself. Detectives testified about the incident weeks later at Primary Children's Hospital, where Smith was accused of trespassing in the facility, interfering with his 4-year-old son's medical care, tampering with the medical equipment that was keeping the boy stable. He was arrested for domestic violence shortly thereafter, painting a picture of ongoing, escalating volatility. The prosecution argued that even in mental disarray, adults are responsible for protecting children from obvious danger, and Smith's actions showed a pattern of planning and disregard. It became a battle between intent and recklessness, but the outcome would hinge on one more piece of testimony. A detective took the stand to recount Smith's final voluntary statement months earlier. He had been asked directly, "Why didn't you turn around when the children begged?" Smith replied, "I thought it was important. They needed to face it." That sentence, those 7 words, prosecutors argued that this was not confusion or panic. This was purpose, a mindset, a belief that children should endure suffering, even life-threatening suffering, to meet some personal or spiritual ideal. The courtroom energy shifted. Jurors exchanged glances, some stunned, others visibly disturbed. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. 6 hours later, they returned, guilty on all major counts. The judge called the case one of the most extreme failures of parental responsibility ever presented in this courtroom. Smith was sentenced to 3 consecutive sentences of 1 to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole far in the future, and only after completing extensive psychological evaluation and treatment programs. The courtroom was quiet as the sentence was read. Not triumphant, not emotional, just relief. Relief that the children were safe, alive, and finally heard. The children were placed with their mother and extended family, surrounded by therapists, medical teams, and specialists trained in trauma recovery. Reports later confirmed the boy who suffered severe hypothermia and stroke was progressing far better than expected. The youngest was responding well to emotional support. The eldest was receiving long-term counseling for survivor's guilt. Their mother released a single statement: "My children are safe. They are healing. That is what matters now." The case of Micah Smith forced the public, and even experienced investigators, to confront a painful reality. Sometimes danger doesn't come from strangers, or predators, or criminals hiding in the dark. Sometimes it comes from someone who is supposed to love you, someone who believes they're doing the right thing, even as they lead you into a storm you cannot survive. And yet, even with the verdict delivered, one question still lingers in the minds of investigators and the public. What exactly did Micah Smith believe he was preparing his children for? A question only he knows the answer to, and one he has never explained. And as always, you've been watching True Crime Story Vault, where every case is examined with facts, clarity, and respect for the people affected. If you want to see more deep-dive true crime investigations like this one, make sure you subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments.